Everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. Our show is brought to you by UCAN. On today's episode, we have Chase Ingraham and Max El-Hag, the head coach at Training Think Tank, here to discuss whether training camps should program off-season competitions. Max, you recently discussed this topic a few weeks ago on the TTT podcast, and I really think it's a great topic to dive into. So I'll start with you as somebody who coaches several games athletes, as well as semifinal level athletes. Does it become problematic when athletes from the camp who's programming the event are competing in that competition?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer would be yes. I think the more complicated, or it's not even an answer, is a question, is determining why did I say that in the first place, or what makes a fair competition? Because I feel like that's the bias that I would come from. Like I'm a coach. I've been coaching for a decade, so I think about it from the athlete side. So are all the athletes coming here? Are they getting a fair shot at being able to win and take prize money? And also, is it an accurate representation of testing CrossFit's methodologies, the 10 general skills, the three different energy systems, and kind of the unknown and unknowable methodology. So like that's the bias that I would come at it from and say, no, I don't think it's a good idea that camps should program. But I think there's also pros from a professional perspective because some of the camps have some of the most visible people in the market. So if you need a profitable competition, having them involved in it could potentially drive people into it. So I think it's a bad idea from a coach's perspective and from an athlete perspective, and potentially from like a corruption prevention standpoint. Like if you really want to be certain that the sport is going to evolve in a certain way without too much influence from certain parties that potentially have more skin in the game right now, and you actually want it to be an equitable system that grows over time, I don't think it's a good idea. Or I think there needs to be some like specific boundaries to how that's implemented so that it ends up being fair for everybody else.
Chase, what are your thoughts, especially when we are having this conversation of how to legitimize the sport, how to get more eyeballs on? Do you think it's more harm to have it maybe not be as fair by having camps program these competitions?
I don't know about saying harm, but my first blush answer is I don't see a problem with training camps doing that. I think it's good for the training camps to maybe put their stamp in a more bigger light, because a lot of time training camps programming doesn't get highlighted as much as their athletes. So I think it'd be a really cool thing for the training camps. My caveat or my big if and only if their athletes are not competing in the competition, is what I would throw out at. Right.
Yeah.
And you look at you look at every programmer. To me, I am, well, obviously I have a podcast only about programming. Is like I am obsessed with it. Right. It's one of my biggest passions in CrossFit, aside from coaching and helping people. And I look at programming just like I would in any type of art, whether it's a music skill. But if we relate it to, say, like painting, it's an artistry. And a programmer, I think Max can speak to this too, is like there is always a personal thread in there somewhere. And Bill and I have said is like you always see the programmer within the programming. It is not a glaring thing, but they always have their stamp, whether they do it intentionally or not. And with that comes their programming they give their athletes. So even if it's unintentional, with no purposeful intent to program for your athletes, there is that carryover. And other than just like the optics view of that, right? And so say, Max in Training Think Tank program for Wadapalooza, and his three of his athletes get in the top 5. Most people would only say is like, oh, well, it's because they do his things, or even as far as like they would accuse people of leaking information. And I think to make things fair across the board is like, yes, let them program all they want, highlight what their abilities are as programmers and test creators, but just take the athletes out of it if that's the road you're going to go out of. That's the avenue I would look at. Now, when Max was saying is like, it's not his fault. He has some of the greatest athletes in the games that people will want to see. So now what do you do? That's the question there too.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Max.
go ahead. No, you go.
No, if you have a thought, carry on from Chase.
Yeah, well, I was going to agree with him in that one of the things that I was going to recommend was, if you're going to do this, there should be some sort of caveat for, hey, if you're associated with this brand in the last year, because everybody does have an unconscious bias of programming, and you could see it at the games this year very clearly with Bosman's different take on how to apply that into testing versus how Dave Castro did for a bunch of years. And so in our position, what we're trying to do is predict, okay, well, what aspects of this are really unknown and unknowable, and what aspects of it are quasi-predictable, so we can create some structured progressions and coaching cues and a plan that helps set people up for success as best as we can in this environment. If I was writing the tests that my athletes were doing and they got to do the training for a year, even if I never gave them the tests or gave them progressions of the tests, the biases that would come out in the creation of how I make tests would also be underlying in my programming. So you're literally letting people train for the tests that you're creating without directly doing that. So I think that that should be one of the bare minimum things that happens, is that there's some sort of protection. The other thing is, like Chase said, that programming's an art, and I agree with that. I think I started as almost like a statistician or a very mathematical coach in terms of, hey, it has to go this way, it has to go this way, it has to go this way. And CrossFit's been very unique because other sports, you know exactly what you're testing for. So you can get clear and measurable and discernible progress from each checkpoint along the way. If at the end of the day, there's a randomness to the testing body, it's hard to know, like, well, did I get better at the things that would be required to get better? Or if I did something differently, would they get better? And I think there needs to be some art, but also some science to how we're evaluating tests. And I think about the Open this year. That was my whole season. My whole CrossFit season was 3 workouts. And that's 90% of people out there.
Yeah.
And if we look at what I did in the Open, there were 3 tests. They were, for me, 9 minutes, 10 minutes, and 15 minutes. So same time domain. We've already failed the checklist of saying we have all the time domains accurately represented. From the 10 general skills, I'd say the stamina, cardiovascular endurance, those are hammered pretty well. You might make an argument for strength, even though the weights were really light for me, and coordination. But then if you were looking at agility, balance, coordination, some of the other aspects, they're kind of not tested at all for 90% of the people in the sport. So I think at some point we need to have some group of people or a group of coaches or a committee within CrossFit that is figuring out, what does it mean to be a CrossFit competition? How do we accurately test this? And then the more difficult question is, if you test like that, how do you make it cool and fun to watch? Because it can start to get really dry and boring and look like a decathlon if you make it too structured.
Right.
But you can also turn it into well, now we're not even testing the thing that we're supposed to be testing and calling it a test of fitness. And I think that that conversation gets amplified times 1,000 if people outside of the CrossFit bubble are writing the program. So I think there just needs to be some checks and balances. And I think that's why we had just hey, let's put a conversation about this to get started, more than we're this is a travesty and we need to take the system down. That's kind of how I think about it. Yeah.
Burn it down. No, but I like it because now we're asking more questions and unraveling it a bit more. And I'm curious, we talk about having a training camp program, one of these competitions, and not wanting athletes from that training camp to participate. But if you look at some of the majors that many of the big CrossFit names like Rogue, obviously Josh Bridges and Chris Spieler programmed that, but then even Dubai or Wadapalooza. Wadapalooza this year, though, is utilizing multiple training camps. Do we think that that might be a solution to make it more fair? Or then is it opening more cans of worms because now all training camps are included in it?
You want to go first or you want me to go first?
Well, I've been pretty vocal on my opinions of having multiple different.
Take a bite out of that one, Chase.
And there was a very glaring example of how bad that can get with the online qualifier that was assembled for Wadapalooza specifically. So, that's one thing. The if you do a collective, just do a better job of managing the different things that Max is talking about. Is the scientific approach is the approach that I really love because it's so objective. What are the 3, modalities that they're within, whether it's, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, or the oxidative where it goes forever. Is every 10 general physical skill like touched on in some even capacity? What's the balance between monostructural weightlifting gymnastics? If there is a overseeing body, then make sure that body is doing its job as overseeing that and not letting things fall through the cracks. And I think one of the things I wanted to clarify for what that Max was saying is, when people talk about it as like, oh, what's the training bias? How can someone who do your workouts be better suited for something maybe you program for a test? And an easy example, and it's not intentional, as we said before, but the best example I got was when they brought in wall walks in the open.
This episode is brought to you by UCAN. Who can? You can. At least I can with UCAN, with one of their easy squeeze pouches that give me the energy I need to get through my workout without causing a crash. When I work out early in the morning but don't want to on an empty stomach because we know mid-wan I'm going to be hangry, I grab one of their super easy on the stomach bars. Chocolate almond butter? Yes, please. I may not be a games athlete yet, but UCAN helps me stay focused and energized during my workouts. It delivers steady release carbs for long-lasting energy without spiking blood sugar levels, the key to sustaining peak performance and focus and recording videos like these. Trusted by top CrossFit pros like Scott Panchik and Emily Rolfe, get your hands on these goodies and even save 20% on your first order with our code CHALKUP. Link in the description. Now back to the episode.
Everyone's like, oh, this is crazy that this was programmed. And I sat there and I looked at our gym. I was like, we've been doing this for 8 years as accessory work. So if I were to program the open, I was like, unconsciously, I was like, what I've never seen, which would really be cool, is that we program wall walks in the open. And then automatically everybody that's been training at my gym has an 8-year training advantage because of that. So that's where those things start to be unintentionally biased and for the athletes who do the training camp programming. Like, I'm curious to see what comes out at Rogue this year. And then let's go look at, the last 6 months of Pay the Man training with Josh Bridges, see what the correlation there. Right. And those are the things we're talking about of being, I don't like to say unfair, because competition is always unfair. It's just, that's the way it works. Right. But as far as making sure the test is appropriately balanced and gives everyone a fair shot at taking the test is, I think, more the lines what we're talking about.
Yeah. And with regards to the conglomerate of people doing tests, I feel so inside TTT, just how we operate. I started realizing this when I was coaching my own athletes. I was like, when I write Metcons, I have patterns that I can even recognize as I'm writing them out. Like 21-15-9s might come out. I like to make things like mathematically lined up in their rep cadence. And then we would go to regionals, and Dave Castro's mind is much more creative and purposefully trying to make sure that anybody that is structuring things gets exposed. So one of the things that I implemented with my athletes was I went to all of my different coaches and I said, okay, write me random Metcons that you think could potentially come out. And I'd use that as a database, but then I'm still overseeing the program. I think what happens if you have a group of coaches is that it turns into like a dick measuring contest. It's like, who can write the biggest, hardest workout? Who can?
This is CrossFit. That's with everything. Is it?
So I think if you did that, you'd have somebody that would be like, okay, here are the parameters of your workout. It has to include these movements. It has to be this long. You have free reign within that to flex your unknown and unknowable muscle, but stay within the boundaries of this box so that our big picture actually looks like a good test, which I don't know if anybody at any competition really has been like actively cross-referencing and looking back at every test and being like, did we even do a good job? Is this a test of fitness, or is this just a group of really hard workouts where the fittest is going to win because they're the fittest, right? Like, just because somebody does well at a test doesn't mean that it's a good test. It means that they're good at taking tests.
Well, and I think especially for the off-season competitions, they're not testing the fittest man and woman the way that the games are. They have that ability to be creative, especially with Rogue. Like, a lot of it is just pure entertainment. So I think like the waters get a little bit muddy for programmers because you have more luxury to really program anything. But I think when Chase is talking about you know, sport is unfair. It's always going to be unfair. There's going to be certain biases. But when we're talking about like people on the podium that are getting payouts and it's leading or directly linked to their livelihood, I think that that's my biggest question with how does it level out the playing field if somebody from TTT is programming Rogue, for example, and 3 of your athletes are on the podium, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also competitive, so I'd probably be like, well, I know they're not good at this, so let's keep that out of the
Yeah,
testing bot. Like,
for
and
sure.
if that wasn't happen consciously, like I wasn't actively like, well, I'm gonna make this decision, it probably would be unconscious. Like, would you like push your close friend to doing something you know they're gonna get beat up doing or get exposed on doing, or would you rather try to set them up for success? Like, it's just human nature, which I think is part of the issue is I thought ex athletes could be a good group of people to do this, or a group of coaches, or like, is Rogue even considered a CrossFit competition? Like, it's an off season competition in the world of CrossFit, but
Mhm.
technically, I think CrossFit will create distance from it and say, well, it's not a CrossFit competition, which makes it harder. I feel like it would almost be better if CrossFit came out and said, all right, we're going to have this. This is what it takes to be a CrossFit competition. This is what good tests look like. Here's our oversight process. You can have creative control, but we need to go through and look through this. But then that creates a whole other layer of work. And like, I don't know if that's what they want to do. They already got to take care of the games and the big
Mhm.
show. So I just think it's an issue for the sport if we start going down the rabbit hole, or we just accept, like, for us, we have a competition that we run internally, but there's no prize money
Yeah.
and we train our people for it. So it's like, we don't think there's a conflict of interest in doing that, but we've been turning down offers because we're like, well, I don't know if that's really a good idea. It's not really good optics on us. I don't think I can be unbiased in doing it. And then it started happening in the market. We're like, oh, this is something to talk about because we might need to do that for our own brand's reputation and stuff in the future, or just like get into the market and be like, okay, well, this is how we would create tests and show the difference as opposed to just talking about it.
So who should program the events?
Yeah.
The
Yeah. I mean,
million-dollar
yeah.
question.
I say past athletes would be a good one.
Mhm.
Anybody that's been involved at the CrossFit Games at the highest level that no longer has a stake in a business that is training other CrossFit athletes, because then that's just a clear conflict of interest if you do it. Another could be a group. I mean, I've met a lot of coaches in the CrossFit space that are level 3, level 4, super good minds about CrossFit, but they don't coach any competitors, but they're fans of the sport. So like, that could be another group that has come in that has seen what's happened over the years and could potentially come up with, a good way of doing it. Or CrossFit HQ, right? They hire a programming team that then has, okay, well, these are the standards. If we let other people do it, we can still call it a CrossFit competition, but here's our checkbox list of things that you have to have in place for safety, for legal liability, for viewership, for like all of the almost like predetermined things to make a good professional comp.
I heard Dave Castro's has a looking for a programming gig.
Oh,
I heard I heard his programming time has been freed up a little bit.
He's now going to program all of the
Yeah.
off-season competitions, CrossFit licensed and non.
I heard he had a spare time in that programming vacuum space.
Yeah. It wouldn't be a bad idea. I mean, they would definitely get a lot of views.
Chase, do you think it gets more eyeballs on the competition when training camps are programming, or do you think it doesn't really make a difference to like the viewer?
I think at the end of the day, it doesn't move the needle as far as viewership or excitement. As much as, like, yes, some people are going to be excited. Usually those people who are fans of maybe who does that programming. But as far as getting a massive change in who's going to watch and who's not, I don't think it moves the needle nearly as much as someone would think, as far as like the discussion, say, that we're having about it. Right.
Mhm.
And in the end, do I really think this is a massive issue with a training camp doing it with their athletes? Not really, right?
Yeah.
Can it be? Because you talk about prize money, 1 through 10. Yeah, when you're talking about 1 through 10, there could be something in there that is worth at least taking a look at. When you, like you said, the CrossFit Games, when the goal is to find the fittest man, woman, and team only, necessarily. Yes. Now I have some thoughts if that it should be the if and only if. I actually think it should be a 1 through 40 look at the whole programming spectrum, but that's a whole nother
That's for another
I
day.
will give that the thumbs up
whole
from my
nother
side.
episode
Yeah.
we can go through.
Okay, so are we leaning more towards the athlete that this is a good thing for the sport, or that we want to see change?
Hold on. Just based on his point, before I answer that specific question, I agree that it won't create viewership, but the economics, I think it would potentially create participation. So if somebody is a CrossFit Mayhem athlete, just as an example, I'm not trying to call them out, but let's say Training Think Tank, so I don't sound like I'm calling anyone out. If
You're calling yourself out.
if I do a competition, then the likelihood that all my individual athletes and all of my group athletes join that competition is way higher. So if you bring in a brand that has more volume than Training Think Tank and you say, okay, well, we're doing an online qualifier, the likelihood that you can turn that into a profitable thing goes way up. And we do need profitable competitions in the market. So I would lean towards the side of saying that I agree with Chase. It's not the biggest problem that we need to solve in the CrossFit market right now. Like, I don't think it's the most controversial thing, but I do think that we should be thinking about it to ensure that our sport doesn't turn into that in the future. Like, we're not then creating this whole off-season circuit that is like, okay, well, I'm going to compete at the games and then I want to go to the Mayhem Classic. So I'm going to jump on Mayhem programming to get ready for that. And then I'm going to go to the Proven Invitational and I'm going to follow Proven. Then I'm going to go to the TTT Open and follow. Like, I just think it would create just kind of a joke way of how the season should operate as a professional structure.
Chase, what's your bottom line?
I'll stick with what I started with is should training camps program off-season competitions? I think it'd be great for the training camps. As you said, if it's participation, I would say is excluding, say, the marquee athletes in that competition. So maybe we're looking at more of the elite side, right?
Yeah.
Because Max made a good point. Viewership, will that move the needle? Not really. Participation, registration, online qualifiers, those big ticket things for a lot of these competitions. I think you're right. I think it would. So maybe you find a middle ground. Your elite athletes cannot compete in the elite division. Everyone else go nuts. So I'll say yes, with the caveat of minus the elite athletes to take a side for people to talk about.
All right. I'm gonna agree with him. So that's
your bottom line. I agree with Chase.
Yeah, publicly making sense. Yeah, no.
Then everybody, I like both of us.
I like that idea because it makes more likelihood that the competitions can be profitable and have attendance and have people there, and then it starts to create. And I think this is something just personally in the CrossFit space, I think needs to start happening. Is there needs to be a more clear separation between this is the professional sport of CrossFit. And this is CrossFit as a competitive community and a group of competitors. Those two things, even though we can like talk like it's the same thing, they're not the same thing. Like the forces that they're dealing with on their bodies, the total volume of work that's required, the fact that it's a full-time job. So I think if you got a pro competition, there needs to be professional standards. If you have a CrossFit competition that's just about CrossFit and community and whatever, then have at it and have whoever program that's going to make it successful and fun.
I like it. Great minds, great conversation. Thanks for joining us. Finally, Max, I've been harassing him for like 8 months.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
He finally appeared.
I was coming on in. Yeah. You're welcome.
Yeah. You were the bait. You lured me in. I took it.
I just dangled Chase right in front of Max and then he came on. Thanks, guys. We'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot.